So he went into a lot of detail about what happened up there and how we lost more of our CIA agents in a single accident involving Area 51 than we ever lost in the field. So there was a lot going on up there, and that's still classified. He still can't really talk about it, not even to a group of former intelligence officers who had all signed secrecy oaths and everything else, and he still couldn't go into it. So his presentation was rather thin. But he did talk about the U-2 programs and Francis Gary Powers and all of that, and everybody in the audience understood that when he's talking about Francis Gary Powers, the pilot of the U-2 who was shot down over the Soviet Union, we're also talking about Lee Harvey Oswald. We're also talking about Oswald's involvement with that particular part of the space program, because Oswald was stationed, as we know, at Atsugi Air Force Base in Japan, which was one of only 2 bases in the world at which the U-2 would take off from. That was the base where it was kept. So the flights from Japan went over the Soviet Union, and Oswald's job as a radar operator was in the room with the traffic controllers that were sending up the U-2s. So every time we turn around, in these major political events, we run across the space program again, in some way, shape, or form. It was insidious. It involved all sorts of aspects of American life, things that we would never expect. Why did people who worked at Riley Coffee Company all go to work for NASA? Why did Oswald claim that he was getting a job at NASA? Why did all these other spooks and all these other strange people wind up somehow with the space program and then again with the Kennedy assassination? There is something very serious going on here. There's a very strange part of American history, and by extension, in a way, of American and world history that's taking place with the space program. If you look at the space programs in Europe, if you look at the space programs in China and other parts of the world, you will see all the connections going back to this one central phenomenon of the space race between the Soviet Union and the United States. And you have to ask yourself, was it really a space race? Politicians on both sides may have thought it was a race. Low-level politicians may have thought this. They may have been stricken with fear that we were in a race against the Russians for domination of space. We may have thought this. But the scientists on either side, I think, never had any illusions about this. There was no race. There was a cooperation. Someone at some point decided the Soviets can go first. They'll have their Sputnik, and they'll send a dog into space, and then eventually they will send an astronaut into space. The Russians had the first go at it. How could they possibly? When we had the creme de la creme, when we had all of the best and the brightest of the Nazi space program. How did that happen? It had to have been a cooperation between the scientists themselves. This implicates or implies that there was another level of government in the world at that time. That there was another basis of cooperation, of collaboration between people that we thought were dire enemies. That there were networks of people operating throughout the world who cooperate with each other in some way, shape, or form. And this is what we have in the space program. They cooperated so much that people died. People were killed. People were assassinated. Serious investigations into the UFOs led to the deaths of a lot of people. James McDonald, famous scientist who went before Congress and insisted that the UFO sightings were not the result of sightings of the planet Venus, swamp gas, or weather balloons. For this, he was ridiculed. He was later found dead. They said he committed suicide. They always say they committed suicide. That's the standard response. Murray Jessup, right, involved in the Philadelphia experiment stuff and a researcher into UFOs and all of that, commits suicide, they say, in Miami, Florida. All of these people who are seriously involved in this study, who try to promote it, who try to talk reasonably about it. Not wild-eyed, aluminum foil hat wearing people, talking that their minds are being controlled from Venus or something. These are serious people. James McDonald was a very serious guy. He was a scientist. He was a doctor, a PhD, a meteorologist. He knew what he was talking about. Dead. Jessup, a very reasonable guy, a very sort of scientific-minded guy, not the kind of wild-eyed guy who would believe anything that anybody ever told him. In the last month or two of his life was extremely paranoid, extremely nervous. He felt that there was something going on, that somebody was after him, and then he wound up dead in Miami. So we have these things connected with the UFO program. Why? If the UFO phenomenon is a figment of our imaginations, if we're projecting stuff onto atmospheric conditions and we're seeing ghosts or something like that, Why all of this secrecy? Why all the murder? Why all the suicides? What does that have to do with just believing in 6 impossible things before breakfast? There's something very serious, something that points to people who are willing to spill blood in the furtherance of a goal or an objective. And the best example we have of that in the last 100 years has been, of course, the Nazis and the SS. People who thought that to kill huge numbers of people was justified for a kind of spiritual reason. The Nazis believed very seriously. This was not propaganda. They believed very seriously in the idea that in the blood is the spirit. They believed that your race carried a spiritual component and that those of inferior races, quote unquote, were inferior spiritually, so it was okay to kill them. In fact, it was necessary to kill them to purify the rest of the planet, to purify the race. This was something they believed very sincerely. And they looked to American scientists who came up with this idea in something called eugenics and the race science program. So, when you have people who believe that the ends justify the means, when you have people who believe that murder is acceptable, even on a huge scale, because of the responsibility they have to jumpstart evolution, the next stage of it, and then they lose a war, do you really think they're going to go away? Do you really think they're going to say, shucks, lost the war, I guess we're all going to become Democrats? You know, it's not going to happen. It just won't happen. Many times I've told people the same example of Christianity. Christianity began and lived underground, in cemeteries, in catacombs, meeting secretly at night for over 300 years before it was accepted in the Roman Empire. 300 years. These people who believed in a kind of an impossible thing, a resurrected person, right? They kept on to that belief for 300 years. The Nazis lost their war in 1945, right? 65, 66 years ago. That's not a long time, you know. Some of them are still alive. Some of these people are still alive and they're still having influence in their own countries. They're having influence as far away as Australia. They're all over the place, you know. And as they die off, they have people who are following in their footsteps, people they've talked to, indoctrinated. They don't go away. This is a cult that does not disappear. The problem with this particular cult is that they're very well funded. And they have a lot of supporters in a lot of countries. I should say, including this country. But a lot of other countries. No one is immune. They're everywhere. Okay? And I'm not saying this out of paranoia. I'm the kind of person who generally does not behave that way or think that way. But the facts, the documents speak for themselves. The presence of Nazis and neo-Nazis in this world in general is growing. It's not going away. I travel a lot. The last 20 years especially, I've traveled to more than maybe 40, 50 countries. And I find constantly in airports, in developing nations particularly, copies of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, this famous hoax that was invented by the Tsarist secret police back before the Russian Revolution. I mean, they're being reprinted in local languages everywhere. Henry Ford, the American inventor who invented the assembly line for making automobiles, was a notorious anti-Semite. He was part of the origins of our military-industrial complex. His assembly line technology was used to make planes and jets and bombs and tanks and everything else. Here was a guy who was as anti-Semitic as Hitler, to whom Hitler gave the highest award that Nazi Germany could give to a non-German, in the same year that he gave it to Benito Mussolini. Henry Ford's writings are being reprinted around the world. His anti-Semitic diatribes that go on for pages and pages and pages are being reprinted and available everywhere. I've found it in airports in Latin America and on book stalls and newspaper stands in Malaysia and Indonesia and in Singapore. I mean, everywhere. Being offered as though it was true. Being offered without criticism, without critique. There's a beginning of a wave of this kind of anti-Semitic, pro-Nazi, pro-fascist sentiment that's taking place. And it's taking place everywhere. It's taking place in the United States as well as anywhere else. Because people are afraid. It's the fear that we've inherited. I talked briefly about Charles Manson. I made a passing reference to him. Charles Manson was brilliant in a sense. He said, get the fear. That was his famous slogan. Get the fear. Become afraid. Marry the fear. Become wedded to it. This way it cannot control you. Understand the fear. Feel it in your bones, and then you can get past it. The idea was to fear completely, and then not to fear anything anymore. Manson famously feared nothing. At the same time, he was a great manipulator. Fear is used to control. It's used to control us in the 1950s as I was growing up in the Cold War. We believed that any moment we were going to be bombed by the Russians or the Chinese. I don't know how the Chinese were going to do it, but we were told the Chinese were going to do it. The Russians, of course, were going to bomb us at any moment. We were living with this every day. We heard the air raid sirens every week. They kept testing the air raid sirens, so we'd always hear an air raid siren. At that time, I lived in Chicago, and the sirens would go off. They kept testing them every week. At any moment, we would hear these things on the wrong day, and we knew the day had come. We would be bombed. This fear made it possible for the military-industrial complex to grow. And then, things kind of quieted down. The Soviet Union fell. The Cold War was, quote-unquote, over. Nothing else to fear anymore. Of course, that would mean tremendous loss of revenue for the companies that had been based on fear, so we needed something else. We needed another enemy. So Saddam Hussein came along. He was very, very convenient for us. So Saddam Hussein was a new enemy, a new scapegoat. New people to hate, new people to fight against, new people to raise an army against. So everybody was happy again back in the state of Connecticut, which is virtually run by the defense establishment. Everybody got their jobs back. And then, of course, famously, we had 9/11. Now, a lot of people will ask, do you believe 9/11 was created by a conspiracy? I always tell people it doesn't matter. Look at what happened. Look at how 9/11 was used. That's what's important, really important. Because 9/11 was used the way, to go back to the 1930s, the way Hitler used the Reichstag fire. There was a fire. Definitely there was a fire. It took place at the German parliament. No doubt about it. What was in doubt was who started the fire. Hitler said they were communists. He said, there's a communist conspiracy in this country. It's going to destroy us. You have to give me all of the authority. You have to surrender your liberties, and I'll keep you safe. We know what happened. In 9/11, the same thing happened. We were told, we have Islamic terrorists that are everywhere. They're going to kill us. In order to be safe, you have to give me, the President of the United States, total power. We have to be able to spy on you. We're going to suspend habeas corpus. We're going to do all these things because we need to keep you safe. Well, what's the point then? What's the point of surrendering who you are and your identity for safety? You can only do that if you feel really, really afraid. It only works if there's fear. If there's no fear, in your right mind, you would never make that trade-off. Never. It would never occur to you to do that. It's only fear that makes it possible. So, as Manson said, get the fear. Fear is this great motivator of people, and fear is used to keep us from looking at what may have really happened, what may have really transpired. So, when we talk about a secret space program, as I've said before, why wouldn't there be a secret space program? Why wouldn't there be? We have a lot of people here. We're afraid of certain things, and the people with power are afraid of something else. The people with power are afraid this planet may become uninhabitable soon. They're afraid there may be wars over water. There may be wars over clean air. Whether or not you believe in global warming, whether or not you believe it was created by humans or not, it's not the issue. The people in charge, they won't tell you this, but they do believe in global warming. They do believe that the planet is gradually becoming less and less inhabitable. So there would be a secret space program. There would be a program to get as many of their people off planet as possible. Why not? Why wouldn't there be? That's a pretty good investment, I think, of time, resources, money, technology, whatever. We know that individual entrepreneurs are developing their own space shuttles, charging a few $1 million for a seat. That should tell you something. What it's going to cost us to get off this planet, if we had to, for any particular reason. So are there people willing to say, we're building our own rocket ships, like in a Ray Bradbury story, we're going to have our own rocket ships, we're going to leave